Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Robert. This is a wonderful audience, I can tell. The speaker can be patient, but the audience usually is not so patient. And I really appreciate your coming here and your patience and your curiosity. I hope I will be able to satisfy at least partially some of your curiosities about what this global crisis that we are in and not quite out of is about, what human security means, what human capabilities connote, and how they are all related. And I will leave you with an optimistic message, but a cautious one. Let me just say at the beginning, before we go into the PowerPoint presentation, that we have problems that span different time periods. We can roughly say some are kind of short period problems and some are long period problems. But the long period really is a collection of short periods. This is not a philosophical lecture about time, so I will not go into that any more deeply than this. But facing the realities on ground, short period problem right now for most people is really quite simple. It is the security of their jobs. For many people, it's the problem of finding a job. For people who have homes, they're worried about whether they can keep their homes. For people who are in debt, they are worried about whether they can ever get out of debt. And of course, for students, literally millions of students, debt is a serious problem. So it is not something abstract. Our short-run problem definitely is a problem of economic crisis for most ordinary people. It may not look like that in the corporate corridors of the world, and especially in the financial corporations which are still in business. Many, of course, went out of business, but the ones who are in business are actually doing quite well, especially in this country, and thereby hangs a tale, one might say. But I'm not going to go too much in detail into that tale because there are other things I want to talk about and draw our attention without minimizing our immediate problems to the long-run problems, which are related, as I said at the beginning, to the short-run economic problems as well. And I want to really draw our attention on three interrelated types of long-run issues. One is, of course, prosperity, economic prosperity, not just in the next year, which actually is not going to happen. I'm going to be a dismal economist at this point, but truthful. But it can happen if wise policies are followed. But we'll have to wait and see, and we can discuss that. The second part, which is related to prosperity, I think, very seriously, is peace. Without peace, I think prosperity for the great majority of the people will be impossible. And even for those who make money out of war or turmoil, life cannot be very secure if other lives for the majority of the people in this world, in many countries of the world, remain insecure. So I think that is something we need to keep in mind. And the third long-term issue that I think is also of great consequence is ecological crisis that has been building up slowly, but now it is much faster. Jim Cole sent me a video of this iceberg melting and dividing, and a chunk the size of Luxembourg, which is actually sometimes called city-state, but it's bigger than a city. It's a large chunk of real estate in Europe. So a chunk of the iceberg of that size has fallen off. And if we are not careful and wise, then we are definitely going to leave a world to our progeny that is not going to be a very good one, let alone a beautiful one. And certainly you cannot have peace and prosperity in a world of ecological crisis. So let me just outline this at the beginning and also give you the optimistic part of my message because this is not going to be a detective story. I won't keep you in suspense. The solution really is in our hands, in your hands and your minds. So we have to think together and individually very seriously about what our role can be now and in the future to solve these very serious problems that face us. And with that, just as in the 1860s in this country, when the country went through a great crisis of civil war, and 1930s when there was the Great Depression, Lincoln said something very, very wise in the 1860s. He said that we must disenthrall ourselves. And that's, I think, a very good word to remember, that we are always in thrall of a lot of false ideas, wrong images. We feel good about things that are actually bad, and we do not look at the world in the proper realistic way. And if we do that, then we are disenthralled. We don't get excited about all the silly things that we are told that we should be excited about, but we don't get depressed either. We feel encouraged to work harder in the right direction. And that is what happened in 1930s when the famous economist John Maynard Keynes told about these false ideas that we fall victim to. And Roosevelt also gave his famous speech that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. So these are anxious times. I realize that fully well. We all feel anxious. No one is an exception. But these are also times of great challenge when we have to pick up the challenge and work together. So I will be presenting something that in part is a bit scholarly, although not scholastic, I hope. And there are some technical aspects which I will probably skip over lightly. If there are questions about those, we can certainly come back to that later. But I will try to make the presentation as accessible to as many of you as possible. So first, a few general concerns. We need to get rid of some bad ideas, and that is what I mean by theoretical inquiry. We also need to focus ourselves on realities in the world, and that is what I mean by empirical. Only if we do those, then we can have good policy-relevant research. So we need a kind of synergy among all these things. And we need to depart from what normally is called neoclassical economic theory, not all of which is bad. In fact, the best neoclassical theorists know all too well the limits of the theory, but the rest of the world doesn't seem to, or at least the ideologues and the people who make propaganda in the popular press and business press do not always seem to know that. And we need to move towards what I have begun to call an ecological global political economy. That's what EGPE means, and I will explain to that. We have heard a lot of talk about globalization, but it's very confusing. So to pinpoint that it is a very complex concept, it has economic aspects, it has political aspects, it has technological aspects, it has cultural communicative aspects, and of course it has ecological aspects. The way it has been presented and the way policies have been formulated in a very simple-minded way can be put in one word, which is liberalization of all markets and removal of constraints. Of course, not everybody thought this way, but by and large, the financial sector of the economies of the world in many countries, not all. For example, India did not go for this. China did not go for this, so they did not suffer as much from this financial crisis, although they did suffer and are still suffering because it affects everybody, but not as much as Western Europe or US or or even poor little Iceland, where it almost all began. It seems like eons ago now. Fundamentally, though, in a deep way, historically, since the end of the Second World War, the regime of cooperation between different sectors of the economy that was created, the global financial architecture as well as domestic financial architecture that were created, they have been dismantled gradually from 1970s on, and it accelerated especially in late 1980s and 1990s. You can actually do interesting mathematical work with this, which I have done to some extent, but we don't need to go into that here. But along with the restructuring of capital, we also have seen a restructuring of nature, a marketization of nature to some extent, but really basically treating nature as a free good in many cases, and dumping negative externalities, as people in economics profession call it. But because the process is non-linear, initially the impact was not that visible, but as the scale grows, and the world economy today is huge in scale compared to even what it was in the 1960s, when it was quite big actually, you can no longer ignore phenomena such as global warming, climate change, chunks of iceberg breaking away, and seeing things at your home. So this is what I mean when I say we need to move into an ecologically motivated global political economy. And we need to think of what we have in society, and this is the job of an economist, socially speaking. What do we have to actually redress our problems? And this is what we call surplus, what you have over and above what is necessary for people to consume at any particular time period in the economy. But we must adjust this for the ecological damage that we are doing. We cannot treat nature as a free good anymore. And of course there are moves on the way, although how adequate they are is a good question, and we can discuss that. We also have multiple resistances as globalization proceeds. About more than 60 years ago, a scholar named Karl Polanyi published a book called The Great Transformation, where he discussed a history of liberalism in Britain, largely in the 19th century. And he talked about something that he called the double movement, that part of capital pushes for marketizing everything, so everything can be sold, which of course has never been true, because there have always been areas of life which are not in the market, although some people think that they should be. For example, a lot of things are done in household. People do things for one another that are not really motivated by calculations of private gain. There is such a thing as love and caring in families. So we do have always a non-market area of life, but there are times in the history of capitalism when the move to make everything market-based gains momentum. And 19th century, the last part of the 19th century, roughly beginning in 1844 in Britain, was one such period. Then the period beginning in 1970s in this country, also spreading elsewhere in the world, the so-called Thatcher-Reagan revolution in the 80s, that has been another period of this marketization move. But Polanyi also pointed out that there are resistances. People resist making everything for sale. And especially where people's livelihoods are concerned, the resistance can be very fierce, and people get organized. Today we have multiple sites of resistance, because it's not just capital versus labor. There are many other groups in civil society. There are women, for example. Gender is a key issue. There are people who care about the ecological environment. So we have green movements. We have people who care about other gender issues, issues. For example, we have the gay rights movement, we have transgender movement, we have movement of minorities, which of course have been a large part of the movements of the second part of the 20th century. We also have the legacies of the great anti-colonial movements, which were anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and in many ways honored nature and life. For example, the ideas of Gandhi in India. I think many Indians are now reflecting very deeply on Gandhi's life and his message, and although many of us disagree with many parts of Gandhi's thought in many ways, you cannot deny that he actually had fundamentally identified some of the problems of modern life, the treatment of nature and treatment of people, and ignoring the consequences of these callous treatments. He was very profound, as was Tagore, for example, another Indian thinker. And there have been thinkers like that in Latin America, among native people in the Western Hemisphere. The whole indigenous people's spiritual tradition, I think, is something that we need to reflect on very deeply. And because of these and from these, we have both a micropolitics, which is everyday life politics, and also a macropolitics, which is larger scale political organization and movement. And those raise the prospects for global solidarities. And local does not remain just local, and we can begin to see that a better world is possible through our collective struggles, but they must be based on reflection and thinking, not just on knee-jerk reactions of one type or another, because knee-jerk reactions quite often actually lead to right-wing fascist kind of movements, and that's what happened in the 30s, and that's what can happen today as well. So I also raise that caution. Human security is a complex concept also. There are controversies raging around this concept since it was introduced in the mid-90s by the UN. And many people, including the UN, wanted to restrict it to just protection of people. But consensus broke down over the type of threats, the place of groups, the role of state versus civil society, etc. Human security is a very serious concept because of the word security. And the Austrian Cambridge philosopher Wittgenstein actually came up with a very interesting idea called language game, that everything we do has a context, roughly. And that context really defines how important or how serious the Speech Act really is. And when people talk about national security, for example, immediately they know that they can trump a lot of other things. They can dismiss a lot of other ideas as being woolly-headed or simple-minded or just coming from people's sentimentality, etc., etc. It's just not serious stuff. So when you say that, no, wait a minute, we can also talk about security in other ways from a human point of view, then it can actually assume a different kind of importance. And that was, I think, what motivated the UN and people around the UN to come up with this. But they were not, very bold or even clear about what they really wanted to mean. And so we have this narrow concept of human security, which is just physical security. Important as that is, we need to broaden the concept. We need to bring in the concept of human livelihood, human social relations. Whether you have economic security or not is very important. Whether you have security in a social sense so that you feel important, so that you feel that you have a place in the community. Whether you have community as such is really a very serious issue of human security. Okay, then we have globalization and crisis of human security today. And I will not go through these concepts here. All of them were developed by a bunch of French scholars. But the real gist of this is that we do have a structure today which is different from the oppressive structures of the past. We are made to feel free. when we have money in our pocket or credit especially, we can go out and buy things. We see things on film or in television or in performances or our own performances become such that we think we are freely doing things, but yet we are not really free. We are being controlled in so many subtle ways. And market actually is one of those subtle control devices. If it is working in a certain limited area, it actually performs miracles. But when you actually abuse it, then it becomes a great threat to human freedom. And that was one of the messages of Polanyi, by the way. Anyway, we are at a stage when we can say, as W. Butler Yeats says in one of his poems, that things fall apart and center cannot hold. That is the situation which we face, and that's what is creating so much anxiety in the world today, I would submit. So we have also another idea, that's the last idea, which is the idea of human capabilities, or it can be called positive freedom. When people talk about freedom, they really sometimes talk about just absence of restrictions. But that is important, but it is not enough, because people also need freedom from want, as Roosevelt put it in the 1940s. And to be free from want, even physical want, you need some income in a market economy, or you need some way to be provisioned. And in a market society, the most automatic way of provisioning is through the market for most people. So unless you are a survivalist, you will need to think very carefully about how provisioning is going to be made. And this is a key aspect of human security. And this has been articulated very well by the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen in his idea of capabilities. He left out a little bit in terms of the social grounding of capabilities, what network of social, political, economic institutions are necessary actually to do the job. But many of us have followed up on him and have tried to push that a little farther. I will not go into the other things right now. So this is the general approach that I'm following, and decentralization and local democracy within a global justice framework is what is necessary, I would claim. And for that reason, we need to do further work on human security. But we already have a lot of work in Asia, Africa, Latin America, in this country, and many other parts of the world, so that we can actually make better policies. So I will skip over some of these things because these are, I have already focused on these generally, and I want to get to human insecurities because that is important for us to grasp. We have at least 7 kinds of insecurities and maybe more. We have political insecurities when people are discriminated against in society, when people are thrown into jail without trial, as happens in many parts of the world. You have to say that society is quite insecure politically. Employment and income insecurities, I already mentioned. Food insecurities come from those, but also they can arise independently if the society is not producing enough food. Health insecurities, of course, we have the great healthcare debate, or what goes in the name of the great healthcare debate now, and it seems rather obvious. We have community, cultural insecurities when we don't have a tolerant enough society, or when we don't have community. Personal insecurities are related to all these things, but have a deep psychological aspect to them. And environmental insecurities are what I mentioned already, but they arise day in, day out from the kind of producing and consuming society that we have created. So we need to find a new strategy because we don't want to be provincial and cut ourselves off. Globalization has many positive aspects, but we need to think very carefully about how to operationalize new concepts and theories of fair globalization, how to connect the operational indicators to human security issues, and how to translate the empirical findings into meaningful and practical policy advice. And since I have actually done some of this work in international organizations, I have some idea about how difficult these are in practice actually to carry out. Even to debate and discuss these things, you need an atmosphere for that, which largely was missing in the 1980s and 1990s. At least what has happened since the Asian financial crisis in Asia and since this financial crisis in other parts of the world is that a space has opened up for a richer dialogue, a deeper dialogue, and I hope that we will have some of that here today. So I could give you examples from my own research and indicate some further strategic areas of research and give you a partial action agenda. And then summarize and conclude, but I will do it very fast. So I will skip over much of these things. But I want to mention that at least there are 5 areas of research that we need to keep in mind. One is international trade and monetary regimes. One is international capital flows, which is part of the first, but is significant enough by itself. And much of the problem of the world today actually comes from the problem of capital flows, which I can go into in more detail during the discussion session. Then international ecological considerations that I mentioned before. Global tax and transfer scheme might be a precondition to what we can actually do in a global level. But if we cannot get there politically, as Copenhagen demonstrated immediately, the question is how we should plan and how we should move ahead. We have a question of asset redistribution and human development, both internationally as well as within specific countries. And we have the question of gender justice, which is last but not least in my list. And it includes all kinds of gender issues, some of which I alluded to before. So we need to deepen democratic governance and development strategy. For that, we need to have research on the relation between governance and what I call pro-poor growth, particularly in agriculture and food systems. We need a decentralization, which is not just an excuse to give local powers their play, so that we can go back to a more primitive society than we started with. It has to be a creative kind of decentralization where local initiatives are respected and encouraged, but we do have a global framework where local power cannot be abused. And that's why local governance is important, and local empowerment in a genuine way, not in the kind of rhetorical way that sometimes international organizations talk about. And public goods and services provision would have to play a crucial role, especially for the disadvantaged people, but also for the advantaged. If you have traffic jams constantly and electricity goes out, even if your GNP is growing at 10% per year, it is not going to be a very good situation. World Bank has a particular approach which I have criticized, and I will not spend time on this right now, but I will discuss some specific things at the end. I want to show that some people think that national government is very important. This is from a particular study, which is in general very good, but here emphasis is on national government, which is okay if it is truly done in a democratic way. But the grassroots organizations at the bottom right-hand corner is what I would emphasize. And there are many research areas. If you're interested, we can talk about them later. But we have a problem in the world today of what I call uneven development. We have a bifurcation of food and agricultural systems especially, but also secondary and tertiary sectors in the economy, and it has consequences. We have the so-called informal sector, which basically is the saving grace of the global economy today, even in developed countries. By that, we mean that people engage in a range of activities that are not always even legally sanctioned, that basically depend on their own initiative and their own interrelations within their communities. Some organizations, like microfinance organizations, have tried to systematize this thing a little more. But by and large, people are living by their wits in many parts of the world, and without that, we would have massive starvation, and the problem would be much worse than it is. But we do need to pay attention to how to actually make this system work much better than it does. The dominant modern system is the one that governments usually pay much more attention to than the other one. And here again, Gandhi actually was way ahead of his time because he emphasized, perhaps rather too one-sidedly, a village-based economy, which I think is impractical in some ways. On the other hand, if we ignore this large, almost 3/4 of the human economy, where people are working and living, earning their living, and carrying on their daily activities, we definitely are not doing something right. And within agriculture, I think these small, poor farms, which are the majority, especially in the developing part of the world, have poor agro-industrial ecologies, but they are facing tremendous crises, even in China and in India, which are fast-growing economies. Brazil, of course, has had a long-standing problem with this, but they have actually a very vibrant organized movement, especially of landless people, but also of small farmers, and that movement was crucial, along with other factors, to create a relatively more progressive government in Brazil, which is still in power, but needs to do much better. In my own research, I have looked at a lot of these things, some of which Jim was alluding to. I will not discuss them right now because I want to wrap this up in 5 minutes, so we have enough time to have some give and take. I have done some work on governance and aid effectiveness also. I will not describe that some of this work is quite mathematical, but the upshot of this is really that foreign aid does not always help the people that they are supposed to help. There is leakage, but that does not mean that aid is completely useless. It can create infrastructure, for example, if you have the right policy. India is one country where aid has been used not perfectly, but much better than in neighboring Pakistan, for example, to build some of the useful things that are necessary for development. But it can be used much more effectively than it has been used. And of course, we can extend this to local governance and food security. And I did some work actually on India at the state and village level, and defined the kind of decentralization that would work. One of the pioneers of this work, by the way, is Pranab Bardhan, who is an Indian-born economist, another Bengali, I think, from West Bengal, who is at Berkeley. Technology and well-being, that is also very important, and there are mathematical models to do that too, but I don't think that is the most important thing. What we need is actually a deepening of democracy at all levels, I think, and making our economy less despotic and more democratic, and that requires a democratic education. There are empirical work. People have gone and actually measured some of these things on food insecurity and poor governance. Countries that are poorly governed, like these countries here, generally don't do very well in food security, and they don't also do very well in civil and political rights. If you have civil and political rights, you of course have some impact on these things, although your growth, GDP per capita, is important too. So for poor countries, economic growth is important. Even for rich countries, economic growth at the right sectors would be important. So we cannot leave economic growth completely out of the picture at this stage of the world economy, at this stage of our economic history. But we have to realize that there are other things along with growth that we need to do. And that's why the title of one of the books that I did with my friend John Weiss, an English scholar, is called Poverty Strategies in Asia, a Growth Plus Approach, that we need other things, not just growth. And democratic rights are very important among them. Also, gender issues on women-headed village councils in India, you see that there's a lot more improvement when you get women to express themselves and play a role in making policies. This is also from India. This work was done by some people at the International Food Policy Research Center for South Africa. And you can see where you have community-based organizations, development expenditures are much more effective. The same thing is true actually about international aid as well. World Bank itself now acknowledges that that kind of top-heavy projects that it finances with the liberal dose of empowerment rhetoric, really they do not work as well as people have claimed. So by World Bank itself, they think that capacity is not assessed properly, and it is the constraint is actually much more than this. Again, this is an example of gender equality and improvement of productivity in agriculture. So what can we conclude from this? I want to leave you with a partial agenda of action from below, because not everything is hopeless if one really puts the right emphasis. Now, this is something name, shame, and tame is used quite often by NGOs and World Bank itself, but I think we have to put the same medicine to work in case of the World Bank itself, that we have to deconstruct this rhetorical good governance, this rhetoric of good governance, but you can't just create a counter rhetoric. You have to actually mobilize from below. You have to organize. You have to create these community-based organizations, and many people in many parts of the world are working tirelessly to do this, and I have great respect for them. You also have this marginal poor people's movement, and leadership has to come from the margins, and agenda setting also needs to come from margins. It is absolutely true. The more I hang around with powerful people in the world, the more I realize that the world actually looks very different because of your position. The world that the rich people live in is not really quite the same world as the world in which the poor people live. The world in which the professors live is not quite the same world as the world in which the students live. So, you know, there is a positional objectivity here, and we have to be objective in that way. Instead of just saying that we can do things for others, we have to let others speak for themselves and listen to them, and then allow them to act on their own initiative. So of course it is very important to create these democratic, deeply democratic institutions that will increase voice at all levels, and that applies just as much to this country right now as it does to India or any other developing country. We need to think afresh about civil societies and states, instead of getting caught up in a rhetoric of just personal politics, which may be good in small things, we have to also think in larger terms for society and state, because we do live under those institutions and we cannot ignore them. And we need to be practical. We need to build capacity to deliver services and public goods for enhancing these social capabilities. We have to build capacity of the governed to make claims through these movements. And we have to also build capacity for monitoring performance of the legal system, and especially in the health, education, and ecological justice areas. And again, they are just as necessary here as they are elsewhere, especially for the poor segments of the population who don't quite often know what their rights are even. So we need a whole bunch of things, and I could go on and on, but I don't want to go on and on. I want to listen to you and what you have to say. And once again, I think going back to what Lincoln said during that period of great turmoil and crisis in the life of this nation in December 1862, he said that this was the time for us to really rethink a whole set of issues. and then to act upon this rethinking. So all I have done is really just to put a few things so that we can rethink. Now I want to hear about your thinking.
Right. Professor Khan, could you, two somewhat really short related questions. One is that I'm having a hard time visualizing what a human secure, sort of security in a human sense looks like, right? So could you give us an example of a community? I mean, what exactly is a secure community? What is this objective goal that we're looking for? And then related to that is part of some of the assertion of the non-adaptive, evolutionary, nonlinear relationships. And I guess part of my question is if that is, right, the case in terms of the world, are these policy prescriptions aimed at the local level solely to reduce the variance in terms of what we end up getting? Because it's quite possible that we get nothing that looks like what we were intended to if it is a nonlinear adaptive type system relationship. But first, I think the bigger question is, I don't know exactly what a secure community looks like.
Well, both are really excellent questions. I can't spend as long as I would like to on them, especially the second one. But it's best to start with human insecurities. I think that's why I had that particular slide, 7 types of insecurities. The most obvious example would be physical insecurity, where the physical life is threatened. In political theory, of course, that's the starting point of Hobbes. I don't think we live in a Hobbesian world, but at times it seems almost like that's true. When your physical integrity is threatened, that is clearly a situation of insecurity. So one of the objectives of human security, on which everybody agrees, is providing people with physical safety. And we see this, and this also has a gender dimension. When in DU, which is relatively affluent, you see that there are these phones for women to use and call. You can see that they don't feel completely secure, even in such an allegedly safe environment. And of course, it is connected, for those of us who want to think of it in broader terms, with a whole host of other issues, economic, social, cultural. So you can kind of expand out, starting with physical insecurity. And when Sen started criticizing the standard economic approach in the late 70s, and started talking about capabilities, he was still not terribly clear on this, but I think the intuition, deep intuition, was that just free exchange it doesn't do much for people to feel free and to be really free. So we need an institutional setup all the way from economic wherewithal provision to political and other types of social freedoms to feel secure. So in that sense, the concept is elastic, actually. The idea would be not to make it so elastic that it becomes worthless. So I always try to tie it back to some concrete issues, but we can talk about that. The second question is of course, very complex. It's about complex systems. Talking in general about complex adaptive system always carries this danger. So you have to become more specific. You have to have a model with component parts. What I do in my work, and many others who think like me try to do, is to have a model that has various levels of specificity. Spatially, you could have anything from global, that is the global economy, all the way to a particular locality. Then in terms of coverage of productive activities, different types of households, different types of what economists call factors of production, different types of capital, labor, or natural resources. You can specify them in great detail, and then you can see how the system behaves when you have a policy change at different levels. But I think this is the work is still in its infancy. It's like where physics was in the 16th century, perhaps, if I have to draw an intellectual analogy. But it's very exciting. I could talk about this for the whole day, but it is very complex, and I think your question is very well taken.
You mentioned that the market may actually pose a threat to human freedom, and I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yes, actually, the idea has been around for a long time. In the initial part of Industrial Revolution, there were these people, they were caricatured as Luddites, who broke machines because it was threatening their livelihoods. So for those people, certainly, market actually meant a lack of freedom. They couldn't earn their living. The solution, of course, was not to break machines, but actually to have laws and provisions, which took actually more than almost 100 years in Britain, or even more than that. In Germany, it came earlier, by the way, which is interesting, under Bismarck, where the so-called social safety nets were created. So that's one example. Another example is actually about the environment. When people are free to pollute, there is no cost on it, then it actually impinges upon other people to actually even have good health, as the case of Minamata disease in Japan most famously shows. So those are two examples. I could give you many other examples.
Well, I'll ask one, Haider. Could you talk a little bit about your, in terms of your view of what you mean by decentralization? Are you looking more towards a regional approach to governance, or are you looking more at what might be called a form of anarchism, back in towards a sort of local development kinds of project vis-a-vis eliminating, say, the state governments?
Well, perhaps I do have an anarchist soul, but the head is not quite anarchist. It would be great, actually, if people could simply govern themselves. In fact, that is also the attractive idea of liberalism in terms of market economy. In the standard decentralized paradigm of market economy, people can decide independently without coercion and exchange freely, and that actually is a very attractive idea. In reality, it doesn't work out that way. That is the only problem. Similarly, the anarchist idea that people could have natural groups in which they could interact and decide is a great idea. And one day I hope the world will be like that. And there are, of course, small groups which can decide perfectly well in that way, and I want to encourage them. My idea is, I think, to some extent closer to Gandhi's, where he wanted to have self-governing villages in India, or in case of in this country, it would be self-governing communities. But then you would have a kind of principle of subsidiarity, so that whatever can be decided at the lowest level should be decided only at the lowest level and always at the lowest level. And then there are issues that impinge on lives of other communities as well. And so there may be another level, say district level, where those things have to be decided, and so on and so forth, until you get to a kind of federal or confederate level. And it could be kind of an associative democracy at that level. But there has to be the freedom to express dissent at all levels without repercussions, and there has to be a way to make decisions where they can be reversed democratically at a later stage. But people should also abide by democratic decisions, so it can't be anarchist in that sense.
Maybe just to add to that, this is a very interesting discussion. If you don't realize, he's talking what Thomas Jefferson was talking about, in the 1800s. And in fact, Jefferson called it the ward republics, meaning you would have local governance and then work your way up through to a state or federal levels. The idea, though, is to have people at local levels responsible for what's going on locally. It's a very, very interesting concept. And Jefferson was quite derided in his time by people like James Madison. But he held to that all throughout his life, and it's interesting to hear it's coming back in many areas. Robert, would you like to say a few?
My question is about this wonderful concept of deep democracy, right? And of course, the joke is, how deep does it have to be, which is great. But you know, at Metro State, we're celebrating Women's History Month, right? And I think that you know, in universities and academia, we have done what we can to promote ideas that each generation views as progressive. Now, my question to you is, it's like the chicken and the egg. Is it the politics, or is it the market dynamics that really allows or leads fascism, racism, sexism, misogyny. As I understand it, for every dollar that men make, women make 78 cents.
Yes, that is true.
So how is it that when you mention that category there, that gender, is really a component that we have to reflect on and really try to understand so that we can really perhaps reverse these, sexist or however you want to call it, tendencies in the marketplace. What is the origin of this? Is it the market or is it the people?
Of course, sexism as such predates modern capitalism, and to some extent capitalism can work against it. So markets are ambiguous about this, I would say. But capitalism also a system, if you leave the fable of neoclassical market exchanges. As I said, neoclassical theorists are very well aware of the limits of this, and they know the assumptions under which this system can work, which are very hard to attain in real life. There are periods of crises. We are going through one right now. The 1930s were also years of great crises. There was another Great Depression before 1930s. That was what people meant when they talked about the Great Depression in Europe and North America between 1873 and 1893, a period that lasted 20 years. So capitalism does go through periods of euphoria where you have a lot of growth, euphoria especially of the rich, but it catches on generally. 1920s, the Roaring 20s as they are called, and then 1990s, Joe Stiglitz wrote a book, we call it Roaring 90s. He was rather pessimistic about the continuation of Roaring 90s, and sadly but accurately his prediction was on line. I think the issue of discrimination is something that becomes important during especially those times of downturn, racism, sexism, and I think we have to be very, very aware of that and very careful. One hope I have, and maybe many of you have, is that with increasing participation of women everywhere and increasing rise in the level of awareness and organization also, it would be maybe harder for fascist movements to gain traction in the coming years. And I do expect women, along with men who also are aware and find the solution in their hearts and carry them out collectively in a democratic way, that these women will play a leading role in the movements that are arising and that will arise in the future. So I do have rather high hopes for women to play an even more progressive role than they have in human history so far.
Thank you, Haider, for a very interesting talk. I've actually just started to read I've actually just started to read and think about Polanyi, who you mentioned in your talk, and I was thinking of him as you were talking about the table with the actors involved in global governance, and I was wondering, kind of in light of Polanyi's discussion of the public and private sphere, especially the constitution of the private sphere, if you could talk a little bit about the role of that left-hand column in your table, which is actors coming out of the private sector and the type of role that they play in global governance.
Well, that's a very large question, of course. Let me just quickly outline a few things. Actors from the private sector can play a progressive role or a regressive role, depending on where they are objectively in society. Even many people in the financial community themselves, like George Soros, for example, can play or try to play a progressive role. But I think here ideas are very important. And Polanyi did not probably put enough emphasis on the role of ideas. Because we need good ideas to counter more reactionary or ideas that are supposed to be pragmatic, that if you go too far, then you are being idealistic. That's a frequent criticism for anything that seems a bit more drastic. But usually when you analyze it further, you find that the reason why the elite in society is opposed to some ideas is because fundamentally after some point it will begin to affect their material interests and dislodge them from their position of power and privilege. So we have to keep that in mind. But within that, I think there are all kinds of alliances to be built between the private sphere and the public sphere. But ultimately the struggles are really fought, large-scale struggles in the public sphere. And therefore I think we should not ignore either the personal private sphere of politics in the kind of Foucault or Foucauldian terms, but we also have to focus on the larger struggles and the issues there. There's a kind of dialectics there which is complex, I think.
My question is related to the last analysis about centralism. I think democracy is in place now, I mean, when we are speaking about the system. But when we are again speaking about decentralizing, what do you mean? I mean, there are local authorities who are working, who have the right to work, to criticize, or to bring something good for that community, which is very close, which is not very far, like the capital cities and so on. So what do you mean? What I don't understand is we need the new type of democracy, or we need the new type of decentralizing again, or what does that mean when we say decentralizing?
Thank you. I'm glad that I can clarify that a bit further. I actually was criticizing the bureaucratic, administrative, World Bank-led slogan of decentralization, because those are basically top-down decentralization. The real decentralization, and my reference to Gandhi actually is consistent with it, must come from within those D-centers, those localities themselves. We are arrogant in universities and other places in thinking that only some white male thinkers or some non-white male thinkers usually in universities and other places developed ideas of democracy and decentralization. We forget, and Gandhi also did not know. He actually traveled through India after coming to India from South Africa and learned this by looking at the situation that many communities, perhaps all communities in the world, have their own indigenous traditions of democracy. They also have indigenous power structures. So it's not just democracy or just oppression. It's a dialectic. But we need to educate ourselves, perhaps, about the conditions in those localities before we can implement the kind of decentralization that will work, I think. So thank you for your question.
Well, all right. Well, thank you all so very much, and I just deeply appreciate your coming. And thank you again, Professor.
Thank you.